Most people see Mark Zuckerberg as a tech titan, a genius who created Facebook in a Harvard dorm room and turned it into one of the most powerful companies in the world. To the public, he's either a visionary or a villain, depending on which headline you read. But very few people truly understand what happened in 2022, when Zuckerberg lost over $70 billion in personal wealth in a single year. This isn't just a story about money. It's a story about ambition, obsession, failure, and what happens when you gamble everything on a vision no one else believes in. It started with a dream. Not just any dream, a bold, futuristic vision that Zuckerberg believed would define the next era of the internet, the metaverse. In his eyes, the metaverse wasn't just a tech buzzword. It was the future of human connection, a world where people could live, work, and socialize through avatars in immersive digital spaces. To him, it was as revolutionary as the internet itself had once been. So in October 2021, he made a move that stunned the world. He rebranded Facebook Inc. to Meta Platforms Inc. The company's new mission wasn't just to connect people, but to build the metaverse. Billions were allocated, entire teams were reorganized, and Zuckerberg, the CEO of one of the most valuable companies in the world, went all in. To most outsiders, it looked like a risky PR move, but inside Meta's walls, it was something far deeper. Zuckerberg had become obsessed. Engineers whispered about 18-hour days. Teams were pushed to develop prototypes for VR worlds that barely functioned. Meta's Reality Labs division, tasked with building the metaverse, was burning through cash at a terrifying pace, over $10 billion a year, with little to show for it. Investors began to panic. The stock price of Meta, once a darling of Wall Street, started to fall. Slowly at first, then like a landslide. From a peak of over $380 in September 2021, Meta's stock fell to under $90 by November 2022. It wasn't just a dip, it was a collapse. And because most of Zuckerberg's net worth was tied to his Meta shares, he personally lost more than $70 billion, wiping out nearly 2/3 of his fortune in just 12 months. But here's what no one tells you. Mark Zuckerberg didn't flinch. Behind the scenes, colleagues and board members urged him to slow down, to scale back the metaverse project, to reassure investors by pivoting back to safer bets like Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. But Zuckerberg doubled down. He told them this was bigger than short-term gains, that this was about laying the foundation for the future, and that anyone who couldn't see it just didn't get it. People mocked him. Memes exploded online, ridiculing Meta's awkward virtual avatars and glitchy demos. Tech analysts wrote op-eds calling him out of touch. Some even compared him to past tech CEOs who bet everything on one idea and watched their empires crumble. But what few people saw was what was happening inside Zuckerberg's mind. This wasn't the first time he'd been here. He remembered 2006, when Yahoo offered to buy Facebook for $1 billion. Nearly everyone told him to take the deal. He refused. He remembered 2012, when Facebook's IPO was called a disaster and the stock dropped 50% in months. People said he had failed, but he held on, and it became one of the greatest comeback stories in tech history. And now, in 2022, the stakes were even higher, but so was the conviction. This wasn't just about building a company anymore. It was about proving something. To the world, to his critics, and maybe even to himself. In private meetings, he repeated one phrase like a mantra. I'd rather be misunderstood now and be right in 10 years than be safe and irrelevant. But being misunderstood came at a cost. Internally, morale dropped. Thousands of employees worried about layoffs. Recruiters struggled to bring in talent, as other companies like Apple, Google, and Microsoft looked more stable and more sane. Investors fled. Meta lost over $600 billion in market value. It became one of the largest single-year losses in corporate history. And Zuckerberg, once the world's third richest man, fell out of the top 20 entirely. He didn't fire back. He didn't go on a media tour to defend himself. He stayed silent and kept building. But there was one moment that changed everything. A quiet moment. One the world barely noticed. In late 2022, Meta's board held an emergency strategy meeting. Several high-level executives pushed Zuckerberg to consider divesting from the metaverse effort. One executive, a former Google leader, reportedly told him, "You're burning billions chasing a dream no one's buying." Zuckerberg looked around the room and said calmly, "They didn't buy into social networks at first either, or mobile video, or messaging apps, but we saw what they didn't, and we won." Then he added something no one expected. "If I'm wrong about the metaverse, I'll lose everything. But if I'm right, and I think I am, we'll change the world again." The room went silent, because in that moment it became clear. This wasn't just a tech experiment. It was personal. Zuckerberg wasn't betting on virtual reality. He was betting on his legacy. By early 2023, the consequences of Zuckerberg's gamble had fully materialized. Meta announced its largest wave of layoffs in company history. Over 11,000 employees were let go. The announcement stunned Silicon Valley. This wasn't a struggling startup tightening its belt. This was a tech empire bleeding from its core. Publicly, the explanation was efficiency. Privately, it was desperation. Reality Labs, the unit behind the metaverse, had spent over $36 billion since 2019. The platform, Horizon Worlds, was barely functional. Less than 200,000 monthly active users. Most sessions lasted just a few minutes. Reports leaked that even Meta's own employees weren't using the product they were building. The dream was turning into a nightmare. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, Zuckerberg seemed calm. He began to reframe the company's message. In earnings calls, he emphasized efficiency, focus, and long-term vision. He declared 2023 would be the year of efficiency for Meta, a strange pivot from the bold, high-spending visionary talk of the year before. It wasn't a retreat. It was a recalibration. He started cutting non-essential projects, reducing management layers, pushing teams to ship faster with fewer resources. And while this might have seemed like a typical corporate maneuver, there was something deeper beneath the surface. Zuckerberg was evolving. For years, he had been seen as robotic, a coder who happened to run a company, more comfortable with algorithms than human beings. But the pressure had changed him. People close to him noticed it. He was more present in meetings, more emotionally engaged. And for the first time in years, he started listening more than talking. But not everyone believed in his transformation. Investors still doubted the metaverse bet. Journalists still ran stories mocking Horizon Worlds graphics. Users continued leaving Facebook and Instagram for TikTok. And regulators around the world began circling Meta like vultures, preparing new laws to challenge its dominance. In a rare interview, Zuckerberg said something surprising. "You don't get to build the future without walking through fire. If it were easy, someone else would have done it already." He paused, then added with a smirk, "I'm used to the fire now." That quote barely made headlines, but it spoke volumes. Zuckerberg wasn't trying to win back favor. He had accepted that the world might not applaud him again, at least not anytime soon. And that's when something unexpected happened. In mid-2023, Apple announced its own entrance into the spatial computing space, the Apple Vision Pro. It was sleek. It was powerful. And it validated something Zuckerberg had been saying all along. The future was heading toward immersive computing. Suddenly, the metaverse wasn't a joke anymore. The narrative shifted. Analysts who had mocked Zuckerberg's obsession started writing cautiously optimistic reports. Investors who had dumped Meta stock began quietly buying back in. The company's stock price rebounded, slowly but meaningfully. And internally, a strange thing happened. Morale began to rise, not because the metaverse had become a success, far from it, but because people started believing in the mission again. They saw that Zuckerberg wasn't crazy. He was early. He even took a jab at Apple's headset in an internal meeting, saying, "We've been building toward this for years. They're just arriving. This is our home turf." And in a way, he was right. Meta had already built a massive base of Oculus headsets in homes around the world. They had developer tools, infrastructure, social layers. Apple had brand power, yes, but Meta had been quietly laying the groundwork for years. Still, the road ahead was brutal. Every quarter, Meta continued to lose billions on Reality Labs. Critics pointed out that even if the metaverse was real, it might be a decade away from mass adoption. Could Meta survive bleeding money that long? Zuckerberg didn't have a perfect answer, but he had something else: clarity. He stopped using the term metaverse as frequently in public, not because he'd abandoned the idea, but because he realized the name had become toxic. Instead, he talked about AI, mixed reality, and the future of connection. And quietly, behind the scenes, he began redirecting Meta's infrastructure toward another obsession: artificial intelligence. In late 2023, Meta released a new family of AI models, open-sourced for developers, challenging giants like OpenAI and Google.
The media called it a comeback, but insiders knew it was part of a broader strategy. Zuckerberg wasn't putting all his eggs in one basket anymore. The man who had once been laser-focused on the metaverse now had a dual mission: build the future of virtual presence and make Meta a major player in AI. To the outside world, it looked like a pivot, but to Zuckerberg, it was just the next move in a long game.
Because what no one tells you about billionaires who lose $70 billion is this: they don't see it as a loss. They see it as an investment, a bet, and in Zuckerberg's case, a bet he's still willing to double down on. By early 2024, a new kind of quiet had settled over Meta's massive Menlo Park headquarters. Not the silence of defeat, but the calm of strategy. After a brutal 2-year cycle of ridicule, layoffs, and financial hemorrhaging, Meta was beginning to stabilize. It wasn't triumph, but it was survival. And for Mark Zuckerberg, survival meant adaptation. He started appearing more often in public, but not in the ways people expected. Instead of flashy tech demos or bold metaverse speeches, he showed up on Joe Rogan's podcast, talking about Brazilian jiu-jitsu, discipline, and the importance of learning through pain. Clips of him training in GI and no-gi competitions went viral. He even entered and won a few local tournaments. It was a strange rebranding, from socially awkward CEO to quiet warrior. But to those who watched closely, it wasn't just about martial arts. It was a metaphor. Zuckerberg was showing the world, without saying it, that he could take a hit, that he could be choked, slammed, pushed to the brink, and still come back stronger. In one interview, he was asked what losing $70 billion taught him. He paused, then said, "I learned that if you're going to bet your life on something, you better be willing to suffer for it." That answer surprised a lot of people, not because it was profound, but because it was human. For years, Zuckerberg had been accused of lacking emotion, of being cold, robotic, detached. But now, he was showing something different: resilience. And resilience is a currency Wall Street understands. Meta's stock, once written off as toxic, began creeping upward. Analysts who had abandoned coverage of the company were now cautiously optimistic. In early 2024, Meta posted a surprisingly strong earnings report. Revenue was up, ad performance had improved, and most importantly, expenses had dropped. Zuckerberg's year of efficiency had paid off. But behind closed doors, he was already thinking 5 moves ahead. His obsession with AI had grown. Meta was investing heavily in open-source models, competing head-to-head with companies like OpenAI and Anthropic. Unlike its rivals, Meta wasn't chasing massive commercial API revenue. Instead, it was giving away its tech, and in doing so, quietly becoming the backbone for countless developers and startups around the world. It was a bold move. Some said it was naive, but Zuckerberg had learned something powerful. If you can't win the popularity contest, win the infrastructure war. Just as Google once indexed the internet and Microsoft once controlled the OS layer, Zuckerberg wanted Meta to power the AI layer of the future, not with paywalls, but with ubiquity. And while all this was happening, another silent shift was taking place. Young people were coming back. After years of losing ground to TikTok, Meta had quietly improved its Reels algorithm. Instagram and Facebook started showing signs of revival among Gen Z. New content creators, once loyal to YouTube Shorts or TikTok, were posting on Meta platforms again. Not because they loved Meta, but because the reach was back. And that's the key. Reach is power. While tech pundits debated headset specs and AI ethics, Zuckerberg was building something less flashy, but more enduring. A complete ecosystem. Hardware, software, AI, social, commerce. A tightly integrated loop. One product at the heart of that loop was Quest 3, Meta's latest VR/AR headset. Unlike its predecessors, it had a mixed reality focus, allowing users to see the physical world with digital overlays. It was lighter, faster, more user-friendly, and it marked a turning point. For the first time, people weren't laughing at Meta's hardware. Reviews called it surprisingly impressive. Tech influencers who once mocked Horizon Worlds now posted enthusiastic demos of mixed reality games and fitness apps. It wasn't mass adoption, not yet, but it was traction, and traction changes everything. Zuckerberg, of course, knew this. He had seen it before, with Facebook, with mobile, with messaging. The moment a product shifts from ridicule to relevance, the energy changes. But perhaps the biggest surprise came not from Meta's tech, but from its culture. The layoffs had trimmed excess. The efficiency era had forced teams to move faster. And oddly, in the absence of unlimited resources, creativity returned. One former Meta engineer put it simply, "For the first time in years, it feels like we're building cool stuff again, not just chasing metrics." That cultural shift was subtle, but important. It meant Zuckerberg hadn't just saved the company financially. He was rebuilding belief. And belief is what truly separates visionaries from managers. Because here's what no one tells you about massive loss. It either breaks you or purifies you. For Zuckerberg, the $70 billion wasn't just gone. It had been burned away, like dead weight in a controlled fire. What remained wasn't a richer man. It was a leaner, hungrier one. And that version of Zuckerberg, the version forged in public failure, in boardroom silence, in solitary martial arts gyms, was no longer trying to be loved. He was trying to endure, to outlast, to build something no one else could see, yet. By mid-2024, something remarkable began to unfold, quietly and without fanfare. Meta's numbers started to tell a different story. While Wall Street analysts focused on quarterly earnings, the true transformation was happening underneath. The metaverse, once dismissed as a delusion, was evolving. Horizon Worlds, the platform everyone mocked, had been rebuilt almost entirely. It now supported better graphics, smoother movement, real-world interaction features, and AI-enhanced personalization. It still wasn't a household name, but it was no longer a laughingstock. User retention improved, community events grew, and developers started to take interest again. It wasn't the metaverse Zuckerberg first imagined, but it was a foundation. Meanwhile, Meta's Reality Labs division, though still running at a loss, had found clarity. They weren't just building virtual fantasy lands anymore. They were creating tools, productivity apps for remote teams, fitness environments, educational simulations, and even early versions of spatial co-working. One example? A beta feature called MetaDesk, which allowed users to create a fully customizable workspace in mixed reality, complete with floating monitors, real-time notifications, and gesture-based controls. It wasn't science fiction anymore. It was a working prototype. Suddenly, the idea of working in the metaverse didn't sound so crazy, and yet most people still weren't paying attention. The media was too distracted by shiny headlines. Elon Musk's tweets, OpenAI's leadership drama, TikTok's legal battles. But Zuckerberg, he kept moving in silence. Less public appearances, fewer speeches, no more buzzwords, just building. That shift, from bold oracle to silent builder, confused some. But it was intentional. Those closest to him noticed a change in his inner circle. He was reading more, speaking less, cutting meetings in half. He preferred long walks with a small notebook over all-hands presentations. One board member described him as monk-like, focused on execution, clarity, and minimalism. It wasn't just a personality change. It was a strategy reset. After nearly losing it all, his fortune, his reputation, his company, Zuckerberg had finally learned the difference between building for applause and building for impact. That's why, when Meta's AI team released its most powerful model yet, Llama 4, in late 2024, it came with little marketing, no flashy keynote, no billion-dollar partnership, just a blog post and open-source code. And that's what made it dangerous. Because while Google and OpenAI guarded their models like corporate secrets, Meta was arming the world, giving developers, startups, and researchers access to cutting-edge tools for free. It was a philosophical stance and a strategic weapon. Zuckerberg wasn't trying to own the future. He was trying to become essential to it. And slowly, it started working. Meta's AI began showing up in unexpected places, inside hospitals, research labs, low-cost robotics projects. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't glamorous, but it was everywhere, like oxygen. Meanwhile, back in the consumer world, another shift was happening. People stopped calling Meta just a social media company, because by now it wasn't. It was a hardware maker, with Quest, an AI lab, with Llama, a cloud infrastructure provider, a content discovery engine, and yes, still one of the most used platforms on the planet. And while TikTok's future grew uncertain due to international pressure and bans, Meta quietly scooped up creators with new monetization tools. Facebook Reels, once an afterthought, became a revenue stream for thousands of influencers, many of whom had never earned a dime before. It wasn't glamorous growth. It was industrial. And that was the brilliance of it. Because what Zuckerberg had figured out, the hard way, was that revolutions don't always look like revolutions. Sometimes they look like routine, like infrastructure, like plumbing. He no longer needed to convince people he was right. He just needed to outlast the storm long enough to show them. By the end of 2024, Meta's stock had more than doubled from its low point. Zuckerberg's personal net worth climbed back above $120 billion. But more than that, Meta had regained something harder to quantify: strategic respect. Even critics had to admit it. The metaverse bet hadn't paid off, yet. But it hadn't killed the company either. In fact, it forced a transformation, one that made Meta more agile, more diversified, and paradoxically, more dangerous. Because now, Zuckerberg wasn't just a billionaire CEO with a vision. He was a battle-tested founder with scars. He had been mocked, humiliated, and written off, and kept going. He had watched his empire shrink by 70%, only to rise again. And in the process, he stopped chasing glory. He started chasing durability. And that's what no one tells you about losing $70 billion. It doesn't destroy you. It reveals you. By the start of 2025, something had become undeniably clear. Not to the media, not to tech Twitter, but to those who really paid attention. Mark Zuckerberg had survived. He hadn't just outlasted the headlines. He had outlasted the fear. The man who once looked like the poster child of a tech downfall, a cautionary tale about ego and obsession, had quietly emerged with a company that was stronger, leaner, and strangely more relevant than ever. Meta was no longer trying to be cool. It was becoming necessary. And in Silicon Valley, necessity is the greatest compliment. But what came next surprised even those closest to him. In a closed-door meeting with Meta's top leadership, Zuckerberg laid out his next 10-year vision. There were no grand metaverse speeches, no slides with floating avatars. What he talked about instead was presence. Not virtual presence, human presence. He told his team that the core of everything Meta builds, whether it's AI, AR, VR, or messaging, should be about making people feel more connected, more seen, more alive in their interactions. Not more addicted, not more isolated, more human. It was a dramatic shift in tone. And yet, maybe it wasn't. Because deep down, this had always been Zuckerberg's obsession. Ever since the dorm room days of Facebook. The same 19-year-old kid who wanted to digitize college yearbooks now wanted to digitize the feeling of being together. And for the first time in years, people were ready to listen again. That spring, Meta announced a major initiative to merge its AI research with its work in wearable tech, glasses, wristbands, even neural interface experiments. The goal? Seamless, ambient computing. A world where you don't log into devices. They simply know what you need when you need it. It was ambitious, risky, expensive, but this time, there was no market panic. Because now people believed he could pull it off. And maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. Not that Zuckerberg is a genius. Not that he's always right. But that he's relentless, in a way that makes other billionaires look impulsive by comparison. While others chase virality, he builds slowly. While others chase the spotlight, he hides in the lab. While others pivot, he endures. One former executive put it this way: Zuck doesn't need to win every round. He just refuses to leave the ring. And that refusal, that stubborn, almost inhuman refusal, is why Meta is still standing. Because losing $70 billion didn't make Zuckerberg weaker. It sharpened him. It stripped away the distractions. It silenced the yes men. It turned criticism into fuel. In a world where most founders burn out or sell out, he doubled down. And now, As AI reshapes everything from education to creativity to geopolitics, Meta isn't following the trend. It's shaping it. Its models are used by millions. Its platforms host billions. And its leader, the same man the world once mocked with memes and robotic jokes, is more human than ever. Not in the way he speaks, in the way he builds. Because that's what no one tells you about losing $70 billion. It's not the money that matters. It's what you become when it's gone.